Like, for a preface, I wanted to ask you, can you introduce yourself? Tell me what you're studying or researching over at Georgetown.
Yeah, great. Hi, I'm Jason Brennan. I'm a professor of strategy, economics, ethics, and public policy at Georgetown University's McDonough School of Business. I like that title because it sounds like I knows everything, and I am a bit of a know-it-all even if I don't know everything. I work in a lot of different things at the intersection of politics, philosophy, and economics. So some of the things I'm known for are democratic theory, in particular, criticisms of democracy, issues about taboo markets, questions about utopia and ideal theory, and a lot of stuff in applied business ethics.
All right, that's cool. I do want to, so you mentioned democratic theory and democracy. I wanted to just clarify before we go forward. Are you talking about democracy in its purest form like we saw with Athens, or is it the type we think about today when we see America with a representative democracy?
I mean all of those things. So I like to
Okay,
use democracy as a pretty open definition. So rather than getting into
okay.
fights about is this true democracy or not, I think it's better to just use a pretty open definition and then say, is this like a good or bad form of democracy? How is it working? What's good or bad about it? Yeah. So
All right.
everything.
Okay, so it's like all encompassing. Gotcha. All right. So why should I like want to have a democratic government, like as my own government, or live under a democratic government?
I mean, I think the best argument for democracy is pretty much what we might call an instrumentalist one, meaning you see democracy as a tool and it's not good for its own sake. And it pretty much just goes like this. As a matter of fact, for reasons that are pretty decently understood, democratic countries tend to be better places to live than elsewhere. They tend to do a better job protecting the people's interests. They tend to be more liberal in the philosophical sense of liberal, in the sense of protecting and respecting people's rights. The people who live there tend to have better standards of living and so on. So I honestly, from my perspective, that's the best argument for democracy. It's not that it's great in itself. It certainly has flaws, but it works better than the other things that we've been trying.
All right. And on to the other side of the spectrum, why would I not want to live under a democracy? Like, I know you had mentioned, yeah, it has its flaws. Like, are those significant enough to not want to live under one?
I mean, as of right now, we don't really know of a way to fix the flaws that works, but we do know what the flaws are. And so a good way of thinking about it is, um, democracies ask the people what they want, but as a matter of fact, they incentivize people to think in very uncareful, unreliable, and in really irrational ways. And as a result, people use politics for things other than policy. They vote for policies that aren't particularly good for them. And so, in a way, democracy is often like the people shooting themselves in the feet. And the reason for that is ultimately because since our individual votes count for basically nothing, um, we are all liberated to use our votes for purposes other than promoting policy. So we mostly do with it is engage in kind of social signaling to one another. I'm going to prove to you I'm a good person by doing stupid things that you approve of.
Okay. And on to something you had just said, you were like fixed. Would you say that it's inherently broken, or were you using that as like a loose term?
No, I mean that in a pretty serious way. It's there's an incentive problem built into democracy, and it's an incentive problem that any econ student will know if they've learned about the tragic commons or public goods or anything where there's collective action. Right. So think about, say, the issue of climate change. My individual behavior as Jason Brennan is not going to have any discernible effect on climate change. So whether I get a gas guzzling car or if I ride a bike, whether I keep the air conditioner at 73 or 65, climate change happens or doesn't without me. Voting is like that too. What we do as a collective has a massive effect on government outcomes, but what you do and what I do doesn't. So every single one of us is sort of liberated to use our votes in expressive ways to try to impress others. If I or think of it, here's an analogy I like to use. Imagine you're in a class with 1,000 students, and the professor says, 15 weeks from now, I'm going to give you a final exam worth 100% of your grade, but you're all getting exactly the same grade. I'm going to average everybody's grades together. And you're stuck in this class, and there's nothing you can do to get out of it. You'd probably expect the average grade to be an F because, and in fact, empirically speaking, that's what happens when you do this as an experiment. Because if you study really hard, you personally bear all the cost of studying, but you don't change the grade in any way. Um, so everyone just slacks off and watches Netflix or plays sports or does something else, and the average grade ends up being an F. So this is what happens in democracy. We are incentivized to be ignorant and irrational because we bear the costs of learning, but we externalize the cost of irrationality.
That makes sense. I did see that mentioned somewhere in one of your books that I was looking through earlier for this.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's making sense to me. Um, Another thing, what are a few lies or I guess fibs that we've been told about how our democratic government should be run,
Yeah.
namely in America, but just in general?
There's a kind of a philosophical lie and an empirical lie. So I'll tell you both of those. And when I say lies, I think the people who say this aren't lying, they're just wrong. They're sincere but incorrect. So the empirical lie is that when people vote, they vote for their interests. Their interest doesn't necessarily mean self-interest, just the things that they care about. They vote in order to promote policy outcomes. Empirically speaking, that's almost certainly not true for most people. It turns out that a better way of putting it is Anthony Appiah puts it, people do not vote for their goals. They don't vote for policy. They vote to express who they are. So that's what's really going on. In fact, maybe one out of 10 Americans has something like real policy preferences that affects their voting. The rest of us are just kind of engaging in a sort of signaling behavior in the same way that like I'll wear, say, Boston Red Sox stuff to show that I'm a good Bostonian. I'll vote, for this party or that party to kind of prove to others I'm a member of their group. There's lots of empirical evidence for that. I haven't gone over it, but that's sort of the empirical claim. Democracy doesn't work the way you think it does. I think the moral claim that's false is that democracy is a form of consent. The relationship you have to your government is consensual or contractual. And the best way to illustrate that is just to think about a genuinely consensual transaction you would have and then think of whether democracy meets any of those. So for instance, let's say I decide to buy this t-shirt, right? Which I did, yeah.
Mhm.
When I buy this t-shirt, I go to a store, I go online to a store, I pick out a particular t-shirt, I say, I want it, I say, I want to give you some money. If I had said no, they wouldn't have sent me the money. So we wouldn't have sent the shirt. They don't have the power to force the shirt on me and take my money anyways. It only happens because we agree. Now, if you have a relationship like that to your government, good for you. I certainly don't. I vote for things and nothing happens. If I say no, for government, no means yes. I can't just be like, no, you don't understand, U.S. government. I think it's fine to smoke marijuana. So therefore, and they're like, oh, go ahead. No, they just do what they want anyways. They take the taxes regardless. They don't even think they have an obligation to protect me. You can look up Supreme Court cases on that. So democracy might be good, but it's not the consent of the governed. It actually lacks all the normal features of a consensual relationship.
All right. And what do you think? I know you just went on a spiel on two different types that like lies per se, but what do you think the solution would be to for us as voters or citizens to these lies and fibs and how to avoid them in the future any more that may come up?
Yeah, I mean, one thing in terms of like getting over this like mistake, I think I would just change middle school civics classes because most of us get taught in the United States a sort of theory of democracy around sixth grade. I even call it the sixth grade model of democracy, which is just falsified. It's been studied at great length and we know it's wrong. And nevertheless, people are taught it dogmatically around sixth grade. So, your middle school teachers are doing a lot of damage to you in terms of understanding politics. They don't do it intentionally. They think it's right, but they're not scientists. They don't know what they're talking about. It's a mean thing to say, but it's true. Sorry, sixth grade teachers. But do better. Do better. You owe it to the kids to do better. You can send me hate mail if you want. In terms of like, fixing democracy as a whole, that's a bigger question. Like, is there something we can do to actually rectify any of the problems we see? And that's like a lot of speculation. Would this policy fix it? Would that policy fix it? And, I have ideas, but there's nothing out there that's really obviously going to work.
All right. And for these ideas, like, were they just something you dreamt up or were they something you like actually thought through?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of people right now in working in democratic theory, whether as economists, political scientists, philosophers, or related fields, who are just like studying, well, what are the problems? Why do they happen? And is there something we can do to like move it around? But we'd have to experiment with it in the real world, and we know that things wouldn't work as well as we might hope. So, for instance, there are people who think maybe we should do what the Athenians did and have lotteries. So by default, everyone's equal, but everyone is equally eligible to be a voter, but then we randomly select a small number of people and they and only they get to vote on things. And the hope is by doing it randomly, it's egalitarian. There's no bias towards race, gender, sex, income, etc. But by having it a small selection, now your vote actually matters. So maybe you put in the time to know what you're talking about. People like me have said things like, well, what if we did something like a voting system where in some way or another votes are weighted according to knowledge? So something like everyone gets to vote, including little children, and even your dog or your cat it won't hurt the system if we let them do that. Everyone gets to vote, but when you vote, you do three things. You tell us who you are, we give you a quiz to find out what you know about just simple basic politics, and then we ask you what you want. And when you get millions of people doing this, you can statistically calculate what the public would have wanted if it had gotten a perfect score on the quiz, but were otherwise demographically identical. So basically, you simulate having an enlightened public or simulate having an informed public. And so there's all this research in political science that uses this method to like study what causes people to want different things and how do things like this or that affect their voting behavior. So we sort of know in principle how to do it. The question is whether we could implement that in the real world in a way that made things better rather than worse.
And I can see how that would be very difficult to implement and like judge based on scores of tests and whatnot.
Yeah.
So yeah, that kind of makes sense what you said now. And I'm gonna shift gears a little bit. And I had mentioned reading some of your books, or at least skimming them. And one of them was The Cracks in the Ivory Tower. And you were talking about the current state of like higher education, university, which obviously applies. You're researching here. We're university students watching this lecture. And what are your worst fears for the current state and like your biggest worries about it?
Yeah. Oh God, that's like asking. It's like being on a battlefield and asking whether you're worried about being hit by a grenade or a bullet. It's hard to judge. Uh, Universities. I think the main issue with universities is that they don't deliver a lot of what they promise to deliver. Right? We make highfalutin promises about what we're going to give to students, and we don't really deliver those things, and we keep making it more expensive. So the sort of value proposition we have to students becomes ever weaker year after year. Because it's like I'm saying I say I'm gonna give you the world. I don't give you the world. I give you much less than the world, and I keep charging you more. So every year, it's like a worse deal. And it's kind of a collective action problem that we keep going to universities because a lot of what we're doing is competing to have better and better credentials. So like basically to get a job that used to require a high school diploma, now you need a college degree. But the person graduating from college doesn't really know much more or have any more skills than the person who was graduating from high school 50 years ago. So I think that's my main worry. And related to that is I think there's just a lot of grift in universities. The kind of thing this happens in the K through 12 system as well, where the faculty to student ratio stays about the same, but the administrative bloat that we throw on gets bigger and bigger. People who here's a good way of summarizing how administrators work at universities. There's only two types of administrators: people who the university would fall apart if someone wasn't doing their job, and people who don't need to be there. There's almost no one in between. That's kind of funny, but it's closer to truth than it might seem. And we keep adding a lot of that latter kind of person because there's weird perverse incentives to do so. And someone has to bear the cost, which is mostly you. Mostly you guys pay the cost. Like you're paying massive amounts of money in tuition. And if you're getting subsidized by someone else, they're paying for it. But you're not paying for instruction or human capital building. You're paying for there to be like a sinecure job for a person who's just wasting people's time.
All right, that makes sense. And nice to know where my tuition dollars are going.
Yeah.
So can you think of, or do you have any theories or solutions to these problems that you had mentioned? Not only the whole university system, but also the previous ones about the democratic government. And you mentioned how there were some solutions to the lies and whatnot, but is there anything?
Yeah, I mean, in general, when you find yourself in a collective action problem or you find yourself in a situation where you can incur benefits for yourself and externalize the cost onto others, that's a bad institution. Economics tells us that at base. Avoid those situations. The question is then, how do we do it? Part of the problem with, say, higher ed is that people don't really know the truth about it. So the dominant theory, if I leave like the walls of an economics department and ask people why higher ed is good, they're going to say students are like unskilled clay, like they're clay, and we faculty mold them into skillful clay. I guess I'm mixing metaphors. We teach you all these skills, and then you make more money. And if that's true, then it's less of an argument. But if it works out to be instead that we're basically just certifying to employers that you are smart, perseverant, and conformist, the combination of these three desirable traits, then you're just getting into this collective action problem where everyone's getting more and more credentials. If so, insofar as the latter thing is true, oddly, one of the best things we could do to help people in the US would be to massively defund higher ed. Just take away all the subsidies, because the first story is we're making you more skilled and more knowledgeable, therefore these subsidies are creating a massive benefit. If that's true, the subsidies are great. On the other hand, if what we're basically doing is having you just get ever more credentials in order to compete for the same pool of jobs, then what we're actually doing is making your life worse. And subsidizing it is a race to the bottom. So it really depends on what the facts are. But if it's the pessimistic thing, then our subsidies to you are pretty bad. And even on that point, by the way, there's a lot of studies on just things like student loan, like government subsidized student loans, right? Do they make your life better? So economic students are going to say the following. They're going to go, well, look, if the government said, we're really upset that people can't afford small cars, so we're going to give everybody a $10,000 voucher to buy a small car. If you've taken microeconomics, you know that won't help anybody. That's just going to make the price of cars get higher. So $10,000 voucher to everybody buy a car, the price of cars goes up $10,000. The consumer loses and the car manufacturers get all the money. That's Econ 101. Does that apply to colleges? Colleges aren't for profit, but it nevertheless turns out when people study this, that when we give students extra money to buy tuition, universities just respond by raising their tuition. So the thing we're doing to make college affordable is actually making it unaffordable. Good for me, though. I mean, it means I get paid more, but bad for you.
Yeah, I feel that a little bit too much. Anyways, that was about everything that I had question wise, but I do want to you have this on Monday, you're coming to visit us. And is there any notes that you want to give to people who may be watching this before and deciding, should I put aside an hour and a half to watch
Yeah. I mean, I
MC
hope you
lecture?
come. Thanks for asking. I hope you come. The main thing I'm going to do in that lecture is just try to answer the following question: is democracy freedom? People say things like the United States is a free country because it's democratic. Is that true? How would we know? What are the best arguments for that view and the best arguments against it? So I'm not going to tell you the truth, like what my particular view is at the end, but you'll walk out of it understanding more about this thing everybody says and everybody takes for granted. You're going to understand that really well at the end of that lecture. And then, and then when you go to parties, you can annoy people by being able to one up them on your knowledge.
All right, I look forward to one upping people. Thank you so much for your time and sitting with me and whatnot. And thank you for taking time out of your day and actually just coming to state to talk to us. I know you're going to get your thank yous then as well.
All right. Well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Bye bye.
Cheers.